All right, so I guess we can get started. Welcome to the fourth event of our public series, South Design's Planetary Futures. My name is Kenny Coopers, and I'll just say a few words now about the series. South Designs is part of the Swiss government-funded initiative Governing Through Design, which supports critical and creative research on how design intervenes in everyday life worlds and planetary politics. And with this initiative, we launched a call for projects to explore how design, when thought and practiced from the South, forges planetary futures. To this call, over 150 teams across the world responded, and a scientific committee helped us refine our conceptual approach and select the projects. The 6 teams were awarded funding and have been working for just over a year now. And the link in the chat, I hope when it will come, gives you an overview of these projects and the teams behind them. In our opening roundtable, we had Paolo Tavares, Jennifer Gabrice, and Michael Urmedimo, who talked about when, what, and where is the South, and what might be the planetary. And they also talked about the contradictory roles of design in urban and environmental change through this lens. Today's conversation asks, what is the future of the rural at a time when sustainability agendas are so strongly focused on cities and on urbanization? And this question frames the work of the Rural Futurisms project team, which today will showcase their work with a particular community on the rural border of South Africa and Botswana. And I'll hand over now to Laura to introduce the speakers, in particular also our critical friend who will be the respondent today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kenny. I can see that some people are still connecting in our attendees list, but we are just going to keep on rolling with the introductions as the numbers come up. So welcome again.
All right, so I guess we can get started. Welcome to the fourth event of our public series.
Oh, one second, do you hear?
Kenny Coopers, and I'll just say a few words now about the series. South Designs is part of the Swiss government-funded initiative.
You know what that was? I still had the YouTube stream open, so good on me. First glitch in 4 lectures, so excuse me. I'm glad not everybody caught that, but yeah, let me rewind. My name is Lauren Kulavens, and I am very, very happy today to be presenting with Kenny a wonderful team that we've been working with called Rural Futurisms, and I'll say more about them in a minute. And they will be in conversation with Germane Barnes as their critical friend in this kind of conversational lecture format, although I think we've moved as far away from a traditional lecture as possible. So Rural Futurisms is a collective of artists, architects, cultural practitioners, writers, and researchers whose mission sits at the intersection of designing rural planetary futures through storytelling, work songs, oral histories, and an overall engagement with new and old design-making technologies. Their mission is to bridge the past and future, tradition and innovation in order to explore the potential of clay artifacts in collaboration with mycelial technology to address the pressing challenges of our time, particularly in climate crisis. They operate within a climate justice perspective, and I'm sure they're going to be saying a bit about that in a minute, acknowledging with that the interconnected social, economic, political, gendered, and ecological factors that shape rural materiality and its relationship to the said climate crisis. So the organization comprises of Lesego Bancheng, who is the founder and lead researcher of Rural Futurisms. She is an urban designer, a landscape architect, and sculptor who's interested in cosmologies and technologies of rural geographies. And through her research, machine learning, clay, and mycelium, she explores speculations regarding both the past and future of rural and peri-urban spatialities. And I think especially the rural-urban binary, we're going to be troubling quite a bit today and possibly exploding. With Lesego are Siyabonga Njika, who is a literary and cultural historian based at the Center of African Studies at Cambridge University. Ruth Manda, who is a professional landscape architect and educator, very competent and thoughtful one at that. Karabo Mawakwe, sorry, and you can correct my pronunciation in a minute. Also a young architect from Mahikeng, South Africa. And Awande Buthelezi, who is an organizer and the lead researcher at the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. We will be giving the floor to Lesego and Awande in a minute, and then the broader team will also be engaging in the conversation as we roll. But now let me also introduce Germane. So Germane is an Germane Barnes is an award-winning research and design practitioner whose practice investigates the connection between architecture and identity, and he examines architecture's social and political agency through historical research and design speculation. Through mining architecture's social and political agency, he also examines how the built environment influences Black domesticity. I think there are also some really exciting linkages there to be drawn with the rural futurism practice in today's event. Born in Chicago, Germane received a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and a Master of Architecture from Woodbury University, where he also received a thesis prize for his project, Symbiotic Territories, Architectural Investigations of Race, Identity, and Community. And Germane is also currently an assistant professor and the director of the Community Housing and Identity Lab at the University of Miami School of Architecture, which is a testing ground for the physical and theoretical investigation of architecture's social and political resiliency. So, yeah. Without further ado, I'm extremely excited for today's conversation, and also for all of you in the Zoom to hear more about what rural futurisms have been up to in the past year of their South Designs journey, and also about Germane's thoughts on their practice. And yeah, I will hand over to you, Lesego and Awande, to give us a few first insights.
Thank you, Laura. I'll just briefly share my screen. Wait, actually, let me make sure. Yeah. Can you see my screen? I want to go ahead.
Thank you, Lesego. So we're going to begin this conversation and provide the prompts through an interrogation of the work that we've done as rural futurisms. And in doing so, we will split the presentation between myself and first, and then I'll pass over to my colleague Lesego, who will then carry it through to the next steps. But where I'd like to begin, and as Laura was able to kindly at least start us in that place, was with this introduction of rural futurisms and the work that we do. And as Laura said, we're an interdisciplinary spatial practice and research project, and the team is obviously comprised of a diverse set of skills, as Laura was going through what we all bring into it. And I think, this also speaks to what rural futurisms sought to do through this research project. And primarily we'll focus on the exploration of rural materiality as an exercise in exploring emancipatory futures and mapping out what other alternative rural futures exist and what they could look like. So we try to do this, and we primarily sought out to do it in the context of the climate crisis and its impact in relation to the global South, and more specifically the African continent and Southern Africa in particular. It being a planetary crisis has its different particularities, and these are the ones that we sought to engage with. And the global, regional, national, and local responses to the climate crisis are generally understood within the binary frameworks of mitigation and adaptation. And we sought to go beyond that. Rural Futurisms research, the way in which it goes beyond this is to explore the potentiality of clay material artifacts in collaboration with mycelial technology within the context of rural materialities and the interrelated adaptive, mitigating, and transformative regenerative potentials. So this is also to say that this project's investigation into traditional and mycelial technology and the potential synthesis between the two within these rural materialities also provides a basis along which we could enhance our understanding of the feasibility of certain other systemic alternatives in facing the climate crisis, both within the realm of spatial and material design, but also by extension through social reconfiguration to meet the needs of transformative mitigation, adaptation, regeneration, as I was saying previously. So by extension, this work that we were doing is an exploration of decolonial futures, emancipatory ecological futures, and other alternatives to hegemonic versions of modernity and carbon capitalism. So this is just the summarization of, the kind of framework and prism through which this work was being explored, which then brings me to our conceptual framework and how we were engaging with this investigation, and particularly the project, which Lesego will also go into greater detail and what we will be discussing today. And the primary mechanism through which our investigation occurred was through a way in which, that we sought to articulate these alternative planetary futures is through an examination of philosopher Ukwe's concept of cosmotechniques. And in his notion of cosmotechniques, he sought to open up an anti-universalist and pluralist perspective on what technology beyond the West looks like and what technology is beyond the Western understanding of technology. And Hue carries out this critical reflection on a renewed relation between nature and technology in the Anthropocene. So this is what Hue was trying to seek out. And in this concept of cosmotechniques that Hue brings forward, it's built on a juxtaposition of nature and technology, but through the relationship between the work of ontological anthropology and the work of philosopher of technology Gilbert Simondon. And what happens between these two is that there is a dialogue that's going on between how we as human beings and our cultural practices facilitate this relation between nature and technology. So the key way in which Hue tries to create a reconciliation between the two is to look at these two schools of thought, what they were trying to do, and the interaction between them to then bring about a new understanding. And he begins this formulation by asking, what is nature? And Hue begins by beginning with the dichotomy of nature's belief as something that is sacred or purely something that we as human beings should have mastery over. And this dichotomy leaves no room. It is not something which is flexible or something we can work around with. So Hue then goes beyond this to speak about, nature as a way of doing things. And in this belief, Hue argues that the world is made up of, human and non-human life, with different cultures engaging and interacting in different ways. So these are various cosmologies that are not just schemas that define forms of participation, but they're also ways in which we have moral reasons for such participation. They underlie a moral purpose in the way in which we participate as human beings and cultures with nature. So this also is to say that this form of participation is only appropriate or legitimate if it satisfies or reveals the moral meaning of why that culture or society engages with it that way. So the preliminary definition that Hue then offers for what cosmotechniques is a unification of a cosmic and moral order through technical activities. And human actions, according to Hue, then are always cosmotechnical. So then this then also allows, or Hue argues, allows for us to ask what will happen to indigenous ontologies and knowledge systems and practices when confronted with contemporary technologies, but also when confronted with contemporary crises and problems such as the climate crisis, which necessitates and requires new ways for us to understand and adapt and deal with what the crisis requires, particularly the scale at which it requires from the different perspectives of these different cultures. So the goal is not to mystify the cosmos or to return to some form of pre-modern cosmology. It's rather for us to find ways of cultivating new epochal senses that allow us to reappropriate contemporary technology, not only to repurpose it, but also to construct cosmo techniques of our era. So the Anthropocene, for example, emphasizes the need to rethink the relationship between people and Earth. And this is an appropriate way for us to rediscover multiple cosmo techniques beyond the current discourse of modern technology that comes out of the history and the context of Western modernity. So it requires us then to also develop theoretical frameworks that allow us to appropriate modern technologies within the context of the Anthropocene in ways that allow us to overcome this opposition between culture and nature. So this is where I will introduce and end off on the conceptual aspect of it as a way for us then to understand the way in which we engaged our investigation. So from here, I'll hand over to Lesego.
Thank you, Awande. So to follow up on, some of the notions that you had, I mean, what do we think when we think of the term technology, right? So technology is a term that we've really associated with an urban context. And so what is a technology that is concerned with not only rural materialities, but rural rituals, rural ways of being? How does that sort of technology look like? And to a large degree, we don't necessarily have to imagine this, but it already exists. It exists in the rich history of, rural settlements in South Africa, but also it exists in, the kinds of relations and material systems that are put in place in rural contexts. So to contextualize that, our first point of inquiry is a village called Makgobistad, which is located near the Botswana border in South Africa in the Northwest Province. It's quite a unique village due to its sharing of the border. A portion of the village historically is located in Botswana, and the other portion of the village, got the South African end of things. So it's a predominantly Tswana village, specifically housing the Barolong Borratsidi of the Tswana clan, who, historically have been a migratory kind of tribe, settling temporarily in spaces, not with aims of, months worth of temporality, but years of temporality. And so a lot of systems have been put into place to attend to the fluidity and mobility that this kind of tribe has afforded to itself. So I must say that the project is not too far from home, that in fact, this is my family village. And so the project, in the way that it began, was quite biographical. So even in our method to do this research, which I should explain that, the project was two-ended. On the one end, we wanted to archive the sort of material techniques that occur in this village. But on the other end, we sought to understand how people in this context imagined their own futures as a place that is not, that is quite regarded as a place of retirement and the likes. And so to attend to the first notion of the project, which was archival, we first used my family or consulted my family members to ask them about people in the village that had or were interested in craft making, specifically with clay. We looked at clay specifically because it was reminiscent of the materiality, historical materiality of the village that is still quite evident in the village today. But also because of its climate adaptive, properties. In this particular village, for example, clay or earth might be perceived as a thing of the past, but as current research shows us the benefits of constructing with mud and clay. And so it's an interesting kind of material that borders, kind of two dimensions in a certain way. So the first point, we spoke to family members and they showed us and introduced us to the chief and other members of the community who were either crafts makers or had collected or retained the clay artifacts within their families. And the other side was to, use a mapping exercise where we looked for, land parcels that had round houses in them. So traditionally, in South Africa, the roundhouse represents tradition and culture. And so our hypothesis was that anyone who kind of constructed this or was able to maintain a mud hut, which takes quite a lot of maintaining, had some sort of, resonance with culture and tradition, and might have some artifacts that we could document and look at in our archival exercise. So we applied these two methodologies together, and with them, we were able to, on site, discover a lot of artifacts ranging scales from the scale of a pot to the scale of a hut. And as we went and collected all these various artifacts, we also collected the stories that came with them. I mentioned earlier, that temporality is something that was almost innate with the traditional settlement. And so a way to respond to that and a way of archiving or keeping things was through stories and praise poems. So as we, went through the various homes or were welcomed in the various homes of the people, we recorded stories and praises and had conversations with people about the value of retaining these kinds of artifacts. And through this exercise, especially with the handcrafted artifacts at the smaller scale, we were mostly analyzing the positionality of these kinds of artifacts within the home. And so in our observations, we had thought, because, when you enter Tswana home, contemporary Tswana home, you are met with the living room. And in the living room is probably a kind of display, a museum of both contemporary artifacts and traditional ones. And so when we entered people's homes and we saw the kind of artifacts in the living room, our first assumptions was that those were the most valued kind of artifacts. But as we sat with people and had longer conversations and built trust, then artifacts that were in the bedroom or in the kitchen, in places that are not open or seemingly so accessible to a guest, started to come through. And these were artifacts that people held a lot of sentimental value over. And so we also, looked at the backyard as a space of discarded artifacts, which are not completely discarded, but they almost represent their time and the fact that time has passed. They are semi-valued because they're kind of kept in a shady area, like a place with shade, but they're left to the elements. And we found this quite interesting because a lot of the artifacts in the backyard had stories about the past, and the ones that were in the interior had stories about relations with people, people that held sentimental value. People, it was almost like a remembrance thing, and they were linked with people as opposed to the ones in the background that were linked with rituals of the past, I mean to say. So it was very enriching exercise of finding these artifacts, which then helped us for our next workshop, which, our aims were to find the local crafts makers, in order to have conversations with them and together with them, create a sort of speculative curriculum about rural materiality. So after our exercise of archival exercise and conversations, we hosted a workshop in the local hall. We had a little bit of help from the local councilman and other village members and my family as well, in order to organize this, which was such a communal kind of exercise. And what we did is that we structured this workshop into two parts. The first part, we wanted to use clay to remember the past and think about the present. And then in the second part, we wanted to think about the future of both clay and a juxtaposition of a material such as clay with other contemporary, materials, as Awanda said, to say, what could potentially be the future of these materialities when faced with contemporary materials, but also contemporary issues. And mycelium was a good way for us to introduce the concept of climate change, because I must also say that, it was quite difficult because clay, for people who are in the built environment, who are researching alternative materials, clay and earth might seem like, materials that are great and responsive, but in this particular community, clay, earth, soil, they represent the past, they don't overtly represent anything about the future. And so these were the kind of conversations we were aiming to have in this workshop about why that might be and how this kind of material can be relevant for this particular community today. And so in the first workshop, we kind of used clay as a form of storytelling and imagining. So the first prompt was use this clay, let us all use this clay in order to imagine rural materialities or just the rural landscape. And then within the same exercise was to use clay to imagine the future of the village. And so when concerned with the past, we saw a lot of things pertaining to rural rituals. So vessels that were used to process food and, things that were used in ceremonies. And then in the second exercise, we saw a lot of things such as a cultural center or, cattle farming. It was always almost economical, which helped us also have a conversation about the state of the village and how people felt empowered or not empowered to pursue these kinds of things that they're seeking after. And then the second part of the exercise, the second part of the workshop was to introduce this mycelium kind of material and kind of find out from community members if there would be an interest in a material and if there were any similarities, in handling this kind of material, which to us seemed to have similar properties as clay, in terms of its climate adaptiveness and its responsiveness and its requirement, its intimate requirement of care and handling by hand. So we actually had quite a great response from the community members regarding the mycelium. We casted a candle holder with them as an introduction to mycelium, and everybody had to wear a mask and wear gloves, which they were already quite used to because of COVID, which was quite helpful. I think the major struggles that we had was translating sort of words that we predominantly use in English or exist within the English language into Setswana and vice versa. Translating ideas for this project that we discussed with community members in Setswana into English. I must also add that only 2 members of the collective, myself and Garabo, speak Setswana. So it was quite interesting, the exercise of translation within this project, which we continue to think of in our curation of an archive of this kind of work. And so our observation was that a lot of material exploration occurs in the Tswana backyard. So as much as rurality or rural landscapes can be perceived as places of retirement or rest or refuge away from the city, when you're located in that context, you discover that there's a lot of aspirations, there's a lot of experimentation and testing that happens in people's own backyards. So some of the things that we observed was a lot of recycling that happened in the yard, where a tire was a planting wall and a beer bottle was, another planting kind of wall. And in a lot of the yards, which we found really fascinating, was always a stack of bricks that were handmade by a tool like this. And so each kind of homestead, or most of the homestead, gave themselves autonomy in terms of producing the materials they required for extensions of their own homes and the likes. And sometimes when there was a surplus, they would then exchange that or sell that with other community members. And so we saw the yard as a very interesting space, and this was a continuation almost from the kind of the understanding and interest that we received about mycelium in the workshop. So our initial plan when we began the project was to find a space in the village to have like a temporary hut, a temporary lab to grow the mycelium and teach community about the mycelium kind of project. But during our first workshop, as we were discussing the benefits of a traditional hut in some of our explanations and explorations about rural materiality, the community members explained to us that a mud hut, the reason why it's an ideal kind of construction for them was that it was because of its ability to regulate temperature. And so when it's hot outside, the mud hut would be cool. And vice versa when it's a different kind of temperature. And so, knowing a bit about the requirements of mycelium at this phase that we explained and we explored together, mycelium, it requires a lot of care, and it requires a sturdy kind of environment that potentially, a hut like that would be able to offer. And so as we communicated with the community members, who very much sought out to transfer their skill of hut building to the next generation, or have it archived, because it might seem like a traditional hut is the same, in every other village, but every village has its own particular ways of constructing a hut. And this particular village, when I came back to this village 10 years after I did my initial research in this village, I'd say that 60% of the huts that I saw then had, been destroyed. And so when we arrived this time, people were kind of, sentimental about the hut and wanting to transfer the skill, to say that, yes, this hut is kind of a remembrance of tradition, but it's also a very practical kind of way of living, or it's a very practical way of being able to construct something yourself, but also living in a place that is effectively doing better for your body than another construction mode. So then, together with the community members, we decided to construct what we call a hut lab. I'm going to just play a video here of our building process of this, which is a very rough draft because we actually recently did this. So please bear with us. If there are any translations that need to be done, we will say a few about that in the end of the video.
Dumelang, o buang ke re kgomoditse monna Pula mo motsaneng o monnyane wa Makgobistat gaufi le Molelwane.
Nna ke nna Malebogô Boikanyo.
Nna ke nna Serati.
Dumelang, my name is Lesego Banteng. I am the founder and leader of Rural Futurisms. I'm going to explain a little bit more about Rural Futurisms, which is a non-profit company that was funded by the beautiful people that we have here. It's an organization that is geared at, adding or aiding development in rural landscapes within South Africa. We see ourselves as people that can instill catalytic change about how we perceive rural landscapes and also potentially the future of rural landscapes. This second workshop, we've been in Makgobistat now. This is day 3, and we're currently sitting or standing in a hut that has been built with community members over the past few days. So what are some of our reflections?
A funny thing about what Bongani was speaking about right now with regards to having attended this workshop and not having been in the previous one made me think, from my perspective as someone, or maybe the only person here right now who doesn't have a design background, so to speak, in that there's two things which I'm getting from the conversation, but also the experience of having been part of this process, in that identity and time are quite interesting factors in terms of how this comes together. The identity of the handprints, as Ruth was saying right now, in terms of how you're approaching it, but the way in which people also bring their own perspectives or uniqueness to it.
Right, and also somebody also brought a failed one, because that's what happens. And that's what happens with experimentation. Again, today and yesterday it rained. When you're experimenting and you're trying something new, you always face the potential of challenges and failure. And that's something that we're facing head on with this project and today, I'd say.
The first workshop that we did was to sort of explore the different understandings of how the mud hut could look like. So each person was given the opportunity to design one, in essence, to conceptualize it in 3D, I think, which is something that is, taken for granted by, design practitioners, and it comes, I think, almost naturally because of, trained to do so. But it was also equally rewarding to see, you know, how conceptualization of space is something that, you know, could be materialized through drawings and sketches and pictures by community members, and maybe that could also be used as a collaborative method in design making and collaborating with people in the community.
gore a dirile jang gore le gore goreng a nnile teng re tshwanetse ra itse ra bona le rona gore nya bagolo ba rona ene ntlo ya rona ene e dirwa jang e bopiwa jang ene e kaya gore o mokae o tswa kae.
Ke nagana gore re ka di aga ka gore re tsosolotsa setso sa rona, re ka di aga go bontsha ba batlang ko tlase. Ke nagana gore go molemo gore re di age gore ba batlang ko tlase ba kgone go itse gore go ne gona le matlo a kgale, re se ka ra tswa mo setsong sa rona, re kgone go tsweletsa setso sa rona ko pele.
Right. So yeah, that was a snippet of some of the work that we did during the second workshop. We're actually working on a much longer video, which we will then post on our platform, where you can hear a little bit more from, you know, the community members and their engagements, quite thorough, kind of speaking about their experience with their project, but also their own histories and perceptions. So yeah, I think it was quite evident in this video that there were a lot of like elderly women or women that constructed this hut. It's quite interesting that the built environment in South Africa is predominantly a male kind of field, but in Setswana tradition, women built the hut. And so it was quite interesting seeing this unfold in real time because of the way that it operated. So the hut almost requires patience and the sun. So what we did is that we would build 2 layers and then allow that to dry. And whilst that was drying, we would all sit together and have conversations and kind of plot about various things in terms of the workshop, in terms of the hut, but also people would just share about their personal lives during those times. And then once it's dry enough, somebody would go assess, and then we'd continue layer by layer, and that's how it worked. And that's such an incredible methodology, we thought, in constructing kind of artifacts that, you know, we think is quite great in terms of relation building and community building as a methodology for building. So we kind of didn't finish the hut because it cannot be built in a day. It requires a lot of time to dry, and the rain did rain, although, you know, the community members were quite grateful for the rain because it was almost a spiritual exercise. You know, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned it briefly, but a lot of the huts that remain in the village today, the traditionally built huts, are spiritual practice huts that almost belong to a traditional healer. And so the hut itself has almost now represents spirituality. And so when it rains, you know, rain represents a lot of spiritual kind of factors for Tswana people and many other Southern Africans. And so there was a gratitude for that, but there was also a sense that this was slowing down the process, which was appreciated, but not. And so we kind of then incorporated Nabil Hamdi's idea of small change. And, you know, we decided that if we gave this particular community the tools to finish up this project, that would be great, and give them autonomy as well to finish this thing. And it's been quite interesting because, you know, they have continued to build it in our absence. Please excuse these photographs. They're from WhatsApp and very difficult to get somebody to send a picture from that side. But yeah, we kind of left the hut at around this phase, but we had all the materials required. So traditional Tswana hut is roofed with thatch or with grass, but again, the project is not a purist kind of project, right? It's a project to speak about materiality that can, benefit this particular community, but also there was the other factor that the grass had been burnt, and so we couldn't use the grass. But on the other side, we are interested in juxtaposing materials and looking for, the kind of materiality that can be explored within this particular village in the future. So our next phase would be to look at the interior of the hut. But for now, our biggest priority was to roof it and protect it from the elements before we kind of left. So yeah, we kind of now watch from a distance as the community members make this space their own for now. And yeah, the next phase would be to then continue with mycelium kind of workshops or giving mycelium and seeing what the community is able or interested in doing with that. But I must also say that they're interested in using the space for many other things as well, which again, laboratory does not have to be exclusive to mycelium, but can be to whatever explorations that, they seek to do within their context. So yeah, I think that's it from us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lesego. It's been a beautiful kaleidoscope, I think, giving us wonderful insights. So thank you for taking us to Magobestad. I would now invite Germane to give a response.
Yeah, so one, thank you for that lovely presentation. I did my homework. I did the readings that you all sent. So I am aware of both Hui's text and Swana text on sort of archiving the domestic space across the various villages there. Well, I would actually like to start is with your exploration in mycelium and why specifically mycelium and what type of tectonic characteristics does it provide that then allows itself to be a steward of the planetary futurism that you're trying to create?
Thank you for that question. I think mycelium almost represents the other side of construction, which is more probiotic, a sort of collaboration, not only like a human kind of perspective on a materiality, but something that was almost collaborative with non-humans. Mud houses, as you see them, they don't only house people or human. In this particular village, a mud house is a home to insects of all types. It's a probiotic architecture, which we find very similar to, mycelium in that way, but also very different. I think we chose mycelium knowing that it's a different kind of process that requires a lot of care and patience. And, we weren't necessarily looking at it for its construction properties because it's not there yet in terms of research. I think we were interested in its potentiality as a material, a contemporary material that has potential that hasn't been completely figured out. And so the question was, what can be figured out about mycelium in this particular context by these kinds of people? What kind of different direction might come from different kind of people thinking about a similar thing that has a contemporary kind of buzz, based on their own experience with a material such as mud or clay.
Would anyone else from the collective like to answer as well?
Yes, I think it's such a great question to begin with because when you go back to what we're saying about Hui and rethinking our relation with nature, I think that it's such a stark way of rethinking with nature because it's working with something that's alive. And there's a very interesting thing which Hui brings out from another a writer, thinker, Donna Haraway, who speaks about the Cthulhu scene as something which could come after the Anthropocene. So it's another kind of thinking or experimentation of, okay, what then comes after the Anthropocene? What kind of world are we trying to build with these planetary futures? And she speaks about, working with, building with, in synthesis or symbiosis with. And I think that working with mycelium is an example of that. And there are other kind of explorations which would be similar to that. But I think that mycelium is probably one of the, most apparent ways in which you can work with something living and is of the natural world to create and facilitate the construction of these human tools. A hut is a very human thing. No other animal does that. But we're using nature in relation with it also because we must negotiate with mycelium. It also has its own particularities to be able to achieve those kind of things.
So the reason why I wanted to start just with the conversation on mycelium is because, as you all know, as people in the design world, in the built environment, mycelium has gotten quite a bit of excitement within people as for its properties, right? Whether that be as something that's clothing or something that's tectonic or something just renewable, as we constantly reconcile the fact that we're exhausting all of our resources across the entire globe, right? Especially on the continent of Africa, where it's constantly being pillaged over and over and over again for its resources. And so the reason why I wanted to start there is because it is so new. It is so under-researched. Its properties aren't really explored to the fullest extent. And this might be a tough question for you all. Why certain rural communities have to be the test subjects for these new types of possibilities, as opposed to other locations where they have more resources, et cetera, and are able to utilize whatever they want in any type of process they want in a more controlled environment, and then being able to use those resources in more under-resourced locations. I'm always wondered and intrigued by why we pick certain locations to investigate versus other locations. And so perhaps you all can talk about why this specific village and why it was a great opportunity to begin to introduce this material.
Can I go? Is anybody?
You can go first, but I do have a point on this also.
Okay, cool. So the project is not only about mycelium. I think the mycelium only works there because of the explorations that currently exist. So in our presentation, I think we try to show the kind of transformations of huts and the transformations of the materiality of huts. So it hasn't remained as this pure kind of soil-only materiality that's in this particular landscape, but they've experimented with adding cement to their soil. They've experimented with adding other elements. There's already a culture of exploration that is afforded by the landscape, that is afforded by the kind of systems that are in place for kind of building there, which is that people in the community build. It's people that make stuff. It's not like our urban systems where things are so far removed from one another, but people can account from source to, product. They can account from source to product the kind of materialities in their own homes. And so mycelium felt like something that would complement this process. And I must say that why can it not happen in a village? That is our question, because I think we do also have some sort of criticism to the way that mycelium explorations have currently been made. I mean, we're building a hut to explore with mycelium that is not clinical, right? And, we grow mycelium way also not in a purely clinical way. Yes, it does require that, but there is room in the research to discover how mycelium can be grown. I mean, another way that you can grow mycelium is using cow dung. There's ample cow dung in this particular village. Another way that you can grow mycelium is with hay. There's galore hay in this particular village. And so why can explorations about contemporary materials not happen? Because oftentimes, Germane, it doesn't happen the way that you said it. Oftentimes, people bring an already made thing to the village and like, let's see where it slots in. But we're saying, how can these people make this thing for themselves in a way that they might want to do? How can they add to research? How can it not? Where can it fail? We're quite open to those things. And it's not about the thing only, right? It's about any other sense of exploration and experimentation that can happen in this village, which I must say, there is high levels of youth unemployment, but also youth demotivation in this particular village. And so our project is one of inspiration and empowerment, and empowerment through being able to imagine yourself doing something else. So even the terminology of laboratory is quite important. How does a lab look like? Who can be a person that's thinking about things like this is kind of why, I'd say that we've attempted to do it in this way. But I wonder, yes.
I think the question is it also speaks right to the heart of like the point of rural futurisms, right? To kind of situate these alternatives, these perspectives, these experiments within the rural context also. And I think that the terminology of rural within an African context has a different kind of purchase to any other region of the world. I think maybe there'd be similarities with like maybe another global South area like the Latin America or Asia, South Asia, East Asia. But within the African in particular, you look at the demographic trends of people moving towards the urban area, young people leaving for work, the way in which the fastest growing cities are in the African continent, fastest growing populations. So there's all this hype about, Africa and the future of the African continent and the future of African societies being in these urban environments, in these urban contexts, these new urban, people and citizens that the continent will be producing. And it's like, what about the rural? And the interesting or funny thing about any person across the continent, there's a similarity in that whether you come from the urban or you're found in the rural, everyone's roots is in the rural. But it's something that we are now physically relegating to the past with this drive of the youth and this drive of like, the vitality and potential of what it has to offer, leaving it. So I think that it's really necessary for us when we have these conversations and we are exploring these potentialities to then also leave a little space for the rural. And I think with our project, we're leaving a little space for the rural because we did all of it within the rural context. But I think that was the important thing for us. And I think also from my organizing work and perspective, when people speak about climate impacts and climate justice, it's always about, what's happening at the grassroots. And I don't think there's any more grassroots than going back to the rural.
I want to allow the other three to say anything before I ask the next question, because I love where this conversation is going.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring, sorry, Sia, I just wanted to bring up, we obviously at the end of our first workshop, people took home samples of the mycelium. And it was also very inspiring to hear them second workshop around talking about their like specimen. Was it successful? Was it not successful? Like people were very intrigued by this material that they were using and actually physically touching it themselves, working with themselves, seeing how it like responds. That kind of empowerment to, be that close to the material and actually use it rather than us coming along and being like, Marcel told you, like, here it is what you can do with it. But saying, here, try it out, test it out for yourself, see for yourself. And then they begin to like form like a bond or a familiarity with it as well.
I just wanted to say something about, Germane raised the question about rural communities being potentially, test subject areas. And we operate on a very different relationship with this project. I think as Lesego had outlined, one of the most important methods that we've used is, family history, right? And so we are beginning where we are standing. The rural to us is not some remote area that is dislocated from our ways of being. We lived there, we were born there, we have family there. And so even that sort of relationship that we have and the sort of depth and intimacy that we have with this project and care that we have taken since the drafting of the proposal a year ago now has not been one which I suppose in the kinds of ways perhaps maybe you are provoking is a transactional or extractive relationship between an external body of or collective who are here for a particular agenda or reason, which is devoid from the sort of ethical ways of conducting research or meaningful work. Lesego is from Mafikeng. She was born there. And this is, of course, not only a project that was also inaugurated by South Designs, but one which she had developed as a student all those years ago, and which we all sort of found resonance in, not least because of our own shared experiences as Southern Africans. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I personally love. Oh, go for it, Karabo.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I also wanted to add, I think, with regards to, contemporary materialities and how they're sort of like developed and researched and sort of like enhanced. Typically that happens in like insular, I think, industries. I think what would speak to the ethos of rural futurisms, I think, is actually enabling the conversation between these contemporary technologies such as mycelium, which you would find that, there are common links, I think, as Lesego alluded to, cow dung, particular substrates that, could accommodate the growth of the substance. In more often circumstances than not, you find that these development of these contemporary materialities are limited to just, designers or elite circles. And I think that, with rural futurisms, this enables us to bridge the gap and to accommodate, rural speculations of how space making and materialities could inform that global discussion of how our urban landscape can be envisioned, in a sense. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I'll explain why I'm going down this sort of trajectory of questioning. It's partially because of my time living in South Africa and working in Bishu. And when you're in these rural communities, what you learn a lot of times is that there's an absolute necessity of space and materiality that doesn't afford yourself a lot of time for experimentation. Because that time that's required for experimentation might be the difference between you having somewhere to live, you not having somewhere to live, you having somewhere to eat, you not having somewhere to eat. It's always sort of a tough conundrum, a position to be in between, do I have the time to explore these different avenues, or do I just want to go back to what I know works because I don't have the time to think through these other things. I don't have that type of privilege at this moment to do these things. So part of me asking these questions is me trying to understand, how do you reconcile this with the elders of the community who have done a certain thing a certain way for so long, knows its effectiveness, knows its success rate, and then say, well, why don't we introduce this new thing that we're still in the process of investigating, and in doing so, it may work out, it may not work out. And then through those workshops, what type of feedback do you receive?
I think I'll begin, and if anybody wants to add, please come along. Yeah, I think that, South Africa is quite a complex place, and rural, peri-urban, informal, these all, they're all different. And they might all have like a similar sense, but they're all quite different. And I think in this particular community, rural, there's a sense of poverty, yes, but there's also a sense of abundance of land, which is quite, different to maybe a rural context that you were in, and an abundance of material exploration. I think in the first part of the presentation, I tried to show that, in people's yards, they're already experimenting with materialities. They are, testing things. And so if you're asking how it works in terms of time, I think, let's say, for example, informality, which is something that almost happens in like an urban context, there's big elements of struggle in terms of space. And then sometimes the more you kind of go outside of an urban area in South Africa, and this is not, of course, in all rural areas, again, rural is such a big word and complex. But in this particular village, that experimentation already exists. it is why we want to do this project there. And it is why people were able to attend the workshop. I think, yes, it's almost caveated by also unemployment. A lot of the times while we were in the village, people came up to us to ask for employment. And, you know, we tried our best in the processes of building to empower and, you know, some of the young people that were interested in that. And then there's also the retired generation, right, who have time, who have time and do a lot of interesting things in their yards and are actually always waiting to see the things that are happening within the village and get involved. And so, yeah, I'd say that it's quite difficult in the face of, you know, poverty and other issues to conceptualize, let's say, with a material that might be expensive, which is why, as rural futurism was almost facilitating or adding to the research about how this materiality can live in this. I think this is a big part of it. I must say that we are actively adding to the mycelium research our own 2 cents about how this material can be cheaper, more affordable, how it can be experimented with by other people for other uses, you know, pertaining to their own kind of needs. And also how other people conceptualize with their own materials that they're currently using their own futures, which they are, even in the face of, you know, struggle and uncertainty. People are always imagining their futures. They don't just stay behind. They try to survive with whatever that is there. And so if we have the opportunity, you know, to kind of be involved in this conversation, I think that we would take it rather than say, oh, hey, let's just sit back. Of course, it's negotiated in the way that we relate and form relations with people, or the way that we operate is part of that. You know, we realize the circumstances that people live in that are in this particular village, but also we realize that's why the first part of the project was really an observational project. We realize their interests also, and you know, want to kind of have a conversation about how to create futures, you know, within that kind of way of living, I'd say. Is anybody?
I think this question opens up a path of also a lot of the more interesting and particular sociological and political aspects of working within the rural. Also, sorry, just need to apologize if I continue to get darker. It's because I've been hit by load shedding, which is our power outage for the international audience. So it's not me doing something with the lights. But yeah, it opens us up to a more, you know, interesting sociological aspect of what it means to work and exist within the rural context. Another interesting aspect about that is that we're all young people. We're all young Black South Africans. So also our interaction with the people in the rural is also subject to, you know, a certain level of formality in how we interact with those who are the elders within the space, those who are from the space, and those who know the space. So we also have to interact and engage with it with a certain level of respect of when we asking about these things, or, you know, trying to also initiate a certain way of trying to explore these things that we're also going to be taught. So there was a huge element of this work where we were learning so much, because every time we were there, it was as much about them teaching us as we were trying to explore these things with them. So it's also like they took us by the hand in certain aspects of, like, you know, this can be done like this can be done in this way. And I think a huge element of that comes from what Lesego was saying about the participation of, like, the older people within the community, who also have an aspect of, you know, understanding what we're trying to engage them in, but also seeing the value of it in that this speaks to something that they already value, even before we arrived there, just that we spoke to something that they cared about already. And also the necessity of, you know, being able to pass this on and to teach it and to carry it on to another generation. And we kind of, in a way, help facilitate that bridge. So there's an element of when we interact in our initial kind of like interactions with people in the area, and the space in and of itself was one in which those relationships had to be built also before you can do anything. So I think that's also another particular aspect about the rural, which I think is quite important to also bring out when we speak about it, is that that's also a lot of the work is building those relationships and also being able to engage with people at that level of they will show you then, and also will facilitate the way in which we can then facilitate that work.
Yeah, I would just add that, communication was absolutely key from the establishment of the project. I think we spent so much time doing site visits for precisely this reason, where we were able, I suppose, as you were asking, Germane, how do we navigate or negotiate managing expectations? Like you said, it's a privilege to, it's not everybody has the privilege to just stop everything and be part of an experimentation when you need to eat, when you need to have shelter. But I think because we had done such foundational groundwork in speaking to the sort of elders and chiefs that Awan is referring to, speaking to Lesego's community, and family members, we were able to build a particular kind of rapport where there was absolute transparency about who we were as young Black South Africans who were interested in this project, as students, as researchers, and that in a way already positioned the project and its relationship with the community in a particular kind of lens, which I think was helpful and very healthy for both sides. And so, of course, living in South Africa, as Lesego had said, with youth unemployment, etc., we could not, of course, ignore the very urgent, needs of the community. However, that transparency was articulated, however, that consent was sort of reached and understood. But we were also in a place, I suppose, as thinking about now the social sciences, where we did had sort of wherewithal to be able to communicate in an effective way, and one in which ensured that we were able to do the project as researchers who had a grant, and not necessarily as in the kinds of ways that you would around this time in South Africa as well, political formations, what do you mean you are erecting a hut? Where's the money coming from? All of those things were in a way delicately communicated on the get-go. And I think part of the reason why we also sustained such extraordinary connections with the community up until the point of erecting the structure is precisely because everybody who was involved was comfortable that they were doing something in which they understood what its objective was, and there was absolutely no confusion about the sort of outcome that we are all collectively committed to.
That's wonderful. So I want to make sure there's no other responses that wanted to be given before I jump on to the next thread, which is, to me, this comes more across as a process of care and a process of recording histories. And those histories are literally just the mycelium and the clay is just a vehicle to record the histories of this village and the way that things have been built before. And so I think about this in the context of climate justice and climate resiliency, where in those days, historically, things were built in a certain way because it's the only way things could be built, right? If we think about South Africa, we think of the clay hut. Clay is the most abundant material that's there, so you build out of clay. If we go further north, you might find different things that deal with humidity and whatnot, and so you build in a certain way for that. And so now in 20th century, we brand it as climate-oriented design, and we brand it as a way of saying net zero design, when in reality, this is just normal for various communities because it's the way that you had to do things. So as you're learning through this process and being able to understand the historical references of how the community has built over time, and then positioning it as a way to go forward, how do you deal with the inevitable rebranding that's going to happen again, as far as a way of you all talking through these climate issues as a way of survival and less about a way of making money, which a lot of people see this as?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because that's something that we do grapple with, and something that we're almost not wanting to do, where we have to take something from the past and then refurbish it to be something that is of a certain time. But I think that's why initially when we began the project, it wasn't our aim to build the hut. You know, this came from communication and workshops with community members where they saw it as something that would be beneficial for the project. And so then I wonder, does that say that for themselves, they also are curious about this materiality, not only in their past, but also in their present, and potentially in their future, because it's something that they, of course, have brought it up. And also not just concerned with, you know, the sustainability of a hut, but also the properties of a hut in dealing with the kind of climate of the area, right? That's a big factor in sustainability that is not often said. It's not necessarily the route of the material, but also its accessibility, and also you know, its properties as a better space to live in the kind of context that you do have. And so I think that is where a level of experimentation comes in, because, you know, Rammed Earth almost has the same kind of thing, because we were tempted to do sort of an exercise showing, you know, different kind of things, that different kind of architecture that is built with mud, right? So when you're thinking mud in this context, you see a round house, but it's a material that can be forged into, you know, multiple kind of forms. And it's not to say that this is what we want, because the project isn't about necessarily building the hut. You know, the hut was an exercise, an archival exercise, you know, sort of part of imagining history, but also saying in what ways can these materials be used to serve a different kind of purpose? Because traditionally in this village, a hut was used as a living space, you know, but now we are all talking about a hut that is used to grow things and experiment. And so I think that is a question that we do think about, you know, rebranding, that is not necessarily something that we're trying to do, but something that we're trying to actively learn from the community how to build this thing, and potentially look at how it might evolve, not necessarily in the ways that it is exactly, because I think that's the nature of, you know, inquiries and experimentation and learning, is that we couldn't have learned a whole lot of things about the building process of this hut and, you know, the deep, intimate relations that it requires if we hadn't built it. And so it is kind of almost distracting when we see the hut as this thing in the project, because the project is not purely about the hut. It's about the processes and the systems that go into making a communal architecture, or an architecture in this context that is local. And so how does it relate to like climate change? I must also say that climate change already in our conversations with the community was quite a difficult thing to discuss, because, you know, terminologies like that don't necessarily exist in Setswana, and the primary mode of communicating that we were using was Setswana, you know. And so the ways that, you know, we could communicate it was about change. And, you know, a few people knew about, you know, climate change in the sort of like hoax, oh, the world is going to end, or, you know, it's getting hot. And so we had to also learn together with the community members about it just, you know, pertaining to other things such as the change of landscapes, and, you know, a change that might require a different kind of change and a different kind of response in terms of materiality, and a change in the landscapes that is quite evident and affecting livelihoods. So yeah, it was a difficult conversation to have, but we had it and it was enriching. And we actually aim to continue having it. And it is particularly because of that concept of climate change that we're building the hut, right? It's not necessarily the answer. It's not the answer to rural futures. It's not the answer to rural materiality. It is the beginning of thinking about rural materiality. I mean, this is our first big materially spatialized pilot project. And so to learn together and to think about how this material can be used, and also how it responds to temperature, I think those were the themes that we saw as, you know, being able to be translated through language and the conversations that we had. But I think also Awande might be able to add to
I think there's an interesting point that you brought in. Obviously, from a climate justice perspective, those who are least responsible also often pay the highest cost, right, for the effects of the climate crisis. And on top of that, as we seek to find new ways of addressing the crises, there's also new avenues for appropriation, right? and exploitation of the ways in which people and communities have been doing things forever. And indigenous communities also responsible for the majority of, protection of biodiversity all over the country, all over the world. Sorry. So it's a very important question, because how do you stop something that belongs to people being taken from them and then brought back to them in a different way? And I think that the beauty of what we're doing also, and what Lesego was saying, that the hut in and of itself is just, a certain point in which this exploration and interaction with the community went. But it was also, this is the decolonial aspect of, trying to rethink planetary futures, because we also had to learn, how do people in this community see themselves, and how do they situate the change that they're experiencing now versus the change that has brought their community to where it is. So that also means us understanding their history, to how they got to the point that they are, but also the differences within the community also. So an example of that is when we spoke to them and they were telling us about, the history of the village being cut in two, the other part being in Botswana, this part being in South Africa. The part in Botswana is the one that everyone refers to as the one that truly is the custodian of the true cultural heritage and understanding of the ways that things are done, as opposed to the South African one, which also brings about really interesting conversations around South Africa's own colonial history versus Botswana's, and how these same community cut in two has had these different trajectories. So there's an element of also this participation and interaction with the community being a way also to facilitate a discussion around what's legitimate in terms of methods and ways of doing things that are appropriate for the challenges that they face. So it's something which I think all communities in the Global South kind of face, in the sense of what knowledge is valid. So there's an epistemic or epistemological aspect to this, in terms of what knowledge and way of doing things is also valid. So the way in which, when we interacted and participated with them, there's nothing in what we took away from it that we could extract that could ever be brought back, I could say, at the point in which this project is right now, that they don't already have ownership to. The difference is how much ownership do they have over their own processes, and then the younger generation also, how much do they see as this being part of their legacy and their heritage also to take forward. So it's also about a way of, like, the thing that you said with regards to, the way people build huts also speaks to a practicality of how people living in those environments saw their needs and the way in which they address them by constructing, and the ways of construction that we now see as being cultural. So it's also a way for us to, reintroduce the conversation, hence the decolonial aspect of this, of your ways were already valid. And there's a validity to them that is required for the world in which we're going to, and the changes that we're currently facing. But that requires for us to explicitly then have that kind of conversation. I think there's a negotiation of that within, I think, not just in the South African context, but in other countries with a colonial legacy, of trying to bring back and then open up that space of legitimacy for these ways of doing things. But in our sense, also, I think in our history, particularly also the settler colonial nature of South Africa's colonial context, also means that there's a different particularity in the ways in which people see and relate to, how these things are done. And also it means that there are other sensitivities with regards to thinking around ways of exploitation and appropriation of these techniques and methods.
So I want to say with full honesty and transparency that I love the work that you all are doing, and mainly because it's one that begins with humility, and it begins with the approach of, we recognize the way that you all do things. We recognize that you are the elders, and we're just here to both support but also provide alternative methodologies. And I'm not sure if this is something that just comes across as just being a Black person. I'm gonna just say it that bluntly, because the work we do in the States is the same way, right? Your grandmother, your great-grandmother, your grandfather, people understand space. They just often don't get the opportunity to show off their expertise because they may not use a certain jargon that makes them a capital A architect or landscape architect or master builder, et cetera. But they have this inherent knowledge. And I think that the approach that you all have taken to both amplify, acknowledge, and celebrate that is something that should be modeled by many other institutions that might think they're doing this work properly and they actually are not. I would love to keep this conversation going because there's like 4 more questions I have written down. We haven't even gotten to gender. We haven't even gotten to these other things. But they won't let me hog the conversation. There are a bunch of people that have given up their evenings and their mornings to also ask you all questions as well. So I just want to say that I really do hope that we can continue to have this conversation going forward because there's so many parallels that I see in the work that you all are doing and the work I do here in the States. And I would love to talk further about that. So I will pass it over to Laura now, who will take you off from here.
Thank you so much, Germane. I'll just keep it short because I also have pages of questions and, my love to this project. But I want to pick up on some questions that have come in the private chat, but also that have been posed, for example, by Zhao, who says or quotes Lucio Costa, who participated in the design process of Brasilia, and who wrote that to urbanize means to bring some of the city into the rural and also to bring a part of the rural to the city. And they are asking, actual trends indicate the end of the rural ? And I want to connect it to another question that has reached me around planetary urbanization and how planetary urbanization implies and almost like an absorption, or rather a universal form, the urban as a universal form, and a process that extends into what we consider rural, and bringing this kind of planetary lens that we also have in the title of this series into tension, I guess, or holding that into tension. How does your experimentation influence, translate, engender, but maybe also trouble these urban processes that stretch into the rural and the rural-urban binary in general? And I think you're giving us an idea through, the fact that you're saying you're not conservative in that sense. You want to bring together new and old. But I would, love for you to maybe, respond to these kind of questions and tensions around the rural and the planetary urbanization debates.
Awande, I think you should get us going if you're still there.
Sorry, my thing just cut right at the end. Laura, could you please just repeat that final part?
The final point was around just a response to planetary urbanization as a kind of a hypothesis that tends to, in its radical form, erase the urban, erase the rural, or absorb it into, yes. A planetary understanding of the human, the humanity as an essentially urban form, right? And how, from your experimentation, you might be speaking back to that, troubling that, informing that, just how you engage with that notion, essentially.
I enjoy this kind of question because it really does challenge the way in which we think about human society at the planetary scale. And I think that that's what is required to actually deal with, confront the beast of the Anthropocene, or the challenge of the climate crises, and all these other intersecting crises that also are being compounded by it. But I find it difficult to see or to agree with an end of the rural. I find it difficult to confidently, agree with, a statement to say that there is an end to the rural. I don't think there could ever be an end to the rural. And I think that there's a reason why human society exists in the form of, multiplicities and diverse ways of organizing that it does, because humans relate to each other and their environments differently. So for there to be a holistic kind of totalizing urbanization at the planetary scale in which the rural can reach some kind of totality or end means a kind of, homogenizing of human relations with each other and nature of the same kind of scale. And I think that's quite impossible to achieve. I think if you look at what, capitalism was able to achieve from the colonial era till now, it's probably the closest force you could say that has come to being able to reach a planetary global configuration of, you know, social relations and ways of existing across the planet. But even in and of itself, it exists in various forms across various communities. So I think that the trends say something, but also the context of where people are and how they choose to meet or face their particular set of problems also offers up forms of, you know, creativity and interaction and participation with each other and the environment, which we are not even aware of yet. So I think that I would be so provocative as to say that, you know, to believe in the end of a rule maybe means that we lack the imagination to think of what the rule can be in light of these, you know, changes.
Yeah, and I'm noting Zhao's clarification about urbanization of the mind in rural areas, and not just, I guess, spatial urbanization. I think that, you know, I also agree with Awanda in that the rural in this particular context is almost synonymous with indigenous ways of being. And of course, you know, actually, let me not even say indigenous ways of being, but let me call it indigenous modernities. You know, the way that people in these particular contexts have imagined a present or spatialized a present for themselves and negotiated with urban materialities. And also, you know, urban ways of thinking, but have reappropriated that to their own context. I think if you kind of look at some of the images that we shared in the video, you can still very much tell that the space is not hyper urbanized in the ways that we know it. It has its own unique qualities that have elements of, you know, what urban areas kind of resonate with, but still, you know, in its own way. And so I guess, you know, it's almost as Laura said earlier, but kind of going away from binaries of both rural and urban and thinking about relationships of places instead. And so it gets very complicated when we even think about, you know, minds, because there are schools in this particular areas, you know, there are education systems, and there's also an outpour, like you mentioned, Zhao, of, you know, people, skills, knowledge, ways of thinking from rural to urban. But I think oftentimes we don't account for those systems that are within the urban that are rural. I think also that's what we're trying to say, that there's a way of making or sourcing that is linked to a different way of thinking about your position within space that can be, you know, learned or observed in urban context, but is not completely exclusive to this kind of context. And so we're not only interested in kind of rural in the way that it was in the past, you know, it's how Dr. Julian Raxworthy speaks about it as a 0 point regarding rural landscapes, but we're looking at rural landscapes as they are, you know, today and how they imagine their own futures. And so this is something that is shared across, you know, rural landscapes in the African continent, where rural has been historically a place of indigenous people, you know, and has, particularly in South Africa, due to apartheid spatial planning, been relegated as this place of the past. And so how did places like this negotiate their own present? It might have elements of urbanisms and you know, modernism, but it exists, and it is, you know, also relevant within the conversation, because you know, a designer is not only an architect, a thinker is not only an architect, but is somebody who's constantly building their lives, you know, in a context, even a context that is not familiar to our own. Is anybody else?
So I'm sorry to jump into such an amazing conversation with a question from left field maybe, and I don't want to take more airtime away from Germane. Maybe the gender question can be thrown in here. I was wondering what new livelihoods or even businesses people that you've worked with imagine with this practice. Not to speak too much in the language of, you know, NGOs about, you know, women and economic development and, you know, how that might all work together. That could be another, you know, reading of this project. I don't want to push you in that direction, but just to ask, what do people really imagine as, futures in terms of their livelihoods? Or is that maybe something you want to develop in the next or in a future stage of this project? Thanks.
Oh, and maybe just to add, maybe you can also tie this to Dr. Scott's question around, which different stakeholders were also part of this futuring process, and your engagement with traditional leaders, just to maybe tie a bow around it.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll answer. I think the answer to your question, Kenny, actually came from our first workshop when we used clay as a way of, speculating both the past and the future. So a way that, we learned about how this particular community or people that were able to attend the workshop imagined sort of their economic future was through still linked to some form of making and agriculture as well. So some people had built like art and culture centers, as a way to imagine, through clay, the future of the village. And some people had modeled out, cattle and farming, because historically farming was, or cattle farming was a big part of the community. But as time went, and with the amount of droughts that have come and gone, again, the effect of, the change in climate, but also just the location of this particular village being in an arid area that gets threatened by desertification. So there was still a lot of things that I guess are categorized as rural, but there was a sense of making that wasn't for a gaze or, for selling, but making as a form of trade and expression and preserving of culture. And yeah, I don't know if Karabo and Ruth can also remind me of some of the things that people imagine through clay in terms of their rural futures.
Lesotho, I think also crafts as well. I think we saw a lot of people there making, I think, elementary forms of, what you would perceive, clay making could become like a bowl, a fork, etc. So I think also it speaks to this economic need of like crafting, and maybe could be trade and expression again. That's a future that they still want to, deem as resilient in, speculating their future.
And
I would say
the business things that they made, a lot of people came and told us that they sew and that the business grow. They were caterers also amongst people that were, there is a sense that there are a lot of things, businesses that people want to open and do, but they're just not, they're not completely empowered to kind of run these or open up these kinds of businesses, because, it seemed as though there was a sort of a demand in terms of like trade and exchanging things, but not everybody almost felt like they had a chance to get around it. So yeah, I'd say that there were multiple ways that people imagined that they could, share their skills and talents, but there was a lot of making through hand and, processes that were made by community members, also in groups like trade of, construction materials, because there's actually been an increase in this particular rural community. But sort of the local council response to this increase was to develop RDPs adjacent to the village. But upon actually, a few people that lived in those RDPs who attended our workshops almost complained about that suburban typology in this particular context. So there has been like a growth of construction within the village, but it would be quite interesting to think and spatialize how for themselves, if this typology doesn't work for them, what kind of typology would serve best their needs in curating their own kind of futures. I think another place that was quite interesting where we see all these like potential avenues was the yard. A lot of people's yard had a lot of experimentation. There was a garden in the corner. There was a place of recycled things. There was a place with bricks. And there's kind of like an economy of like exchanging and selling these various things within from yard to yard. So I do think that does require its own economical study, but we did observe these elements in the village. And you mentioned briefly about gender, and yeah, this is something that's, you know, closely related to the particular kind of craft or artifacts that we were looking at, which traditionally in this village had been made by women. So clay vessels and huts were traditionally built by women. And so this was an inevitable consequence of, you know, the particular kind of artifacts that we were looking at. But also, you know, true to all of that, in this particular village, a lot of women are, you know, matriarchs and providers, and they don't necessarily perceive themselves as, you know, they perceive themselves as people who are in charge of their lives and can provide, you know, financially for themselves and their families. And so we saw that kind of unfold in real time as we did this project. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting to observe the practice of building as something in this village that is not particularly gendered in ways that we're used to, which I think was a useful observation for us to have.
While you're speaking, I wondered whether you could share, because the question came up about the various stakeholders that we have been involved with, and perhaps maybe if you can talk about the sort of traditional protocols we had to observe in terms of meeting people in a particular order, and how you couldn't talk to this person because of we haven't spoken to this one, and maybe also the younger people we sort of also brought into or attempted to bring into the project, and why.
Yeah, I just wanted to check if Ruth, if you wanted
to... I just wanted to add, when we did one of our very first site visits and we were looking at finding artifacts, clay artifacts of all sorts, some people didn't recognize like the value in some of their works. They were kind of just like, oh, this old thing that I had done, whatever, like it's not a big deal. But obviously for us, we asked them kind of why, and they explained, but like we were trying to kind of instill like there is value in the techniques and the materials that you use, and that can still be used in the present day. It's not just a thing that you did or was done in the past. And it was fast forwarding to the second workshop when we had started doing the mud hut and people were kind of excited about its kind of build up and evolution. We obviously had it as going to be a laboratory, but people were speculating about its future. It could be a guest house. It could be a tourist attraction. So there are kind of these, you know, ideas and minds circulating there, but it kind of takes someone to kind of ignite or spark or prod and say, you can do this, and put it into kind of their arms to run with. So that was also very beautiful to see and prompt.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And, you know, to tie into Sia's question about the processes, I think, so I'd have to like explain the way that the Tswana tribe kind of works, which is quite systematic. But, you know, there's the village in its own layout has things that are called khotlas. And a khotla is almost like a judicial space where a lot of conflict resolution occurs. But the khotlas are also hierarchical in that there's like a family khotla at the lower scale. Then there's like an intermediary khotla with a headman. And then there's like a tertiary khotla with the chief. And so to begin the project, you know, it had to begin in the family, in the home, because we had to almost begin in my family's khotla and ask, you know, the elders in my family for, you know, permission to do this work in this particular village. And then from there, the elders were able to take it up or help us, you know, get into contact with the right people, or go according to the right systems, and eventually communicating with the chief about our intentions to do just even research work in this project, and eventually what we ended up doing. So it's very conversational, very hierarchical kind of process that requires a lot of familiarity and care, I'd say. And then once we got to the chief, it was also almost handed over to the local councilman, who actually owns, you know, most of the land in the village is owned by the chief, except for maybe a few things here and there, including the the hall where we built the hut. The hall is under, it's a local municipal kind of land. And so in order to build there, which for us was kind of like a central location because it's along the main road that connects the town Mahikeng with the border of Botswana. So when you drive through the village, the kind of hall is kind of a pivotal place, you know, in the particular village. So we spoke to the local councillor who actually helped us with somebody named Daniel, who was kind of so important in our process because most of us, I must say, currently are not based in Makhobistadt. And so quite immediately in our relations in the beginning we had to create relations with people who would be able to help us with the project when we're not around. Of course, we went to site quite frequently, but in terms of facilitating day-to-day kind of operations to get particularly this mud hut done or help us kind of organize the kind of crafts people that would be able to join, we needed to collaborate deeply with some of the people that were in the community. So I say the stakeholders were my family, then the chief and the local council. And then in the first workshop, we had included some younger high school children to kind of facilitate this intergenerational conversation. And of course, this was almost meant to be in the second workshop, but the kids were only able to attend the beginning because it's currently exams season in South Africa. So that was another negotiation that we actually got like a mid-range of people in their like 30s. You know, South African youth is quite a large range because, again, we need that because of our history. And so, yeah, it was quite interesting to have these different sorts of people involved and thinking about the project in the ways that it ended up being thought of. So, yeah, those are the stakeholders. I hope that answered.
I think, sorry, mentioning this whole process, it's obviously quite thoughtful, considered, and what most people would think is like, quote unquote, slow. And I think that was the same with the building. It also taught us a big lesson in patience, consideration, having to build to a certain point, waiting, having to build. And it was just an interesting juxtaposition between how we operate within the construction industry as designers, architects, landscape architects, how everything is so quick and you barely talk to like, you barely have like an interpersonal conversation with like your team members. It's all about work. And I thought this, going back to the fact that we were learning from the community as well. So trying to also kind of bring this back to our personal practices as well. Most of us, this was our first time building something with our hands. So it was like a brilliant opportunity to kind of learn in this way. And I just thought that was just something I'd add talking about all this. Thanks.
Wonderful. I mean, Karabo, do you want to give a very short response? You had your hand up. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to add to Ruth that, the building process was, like she said, an incredibly humbling experience and something that you can't essentially plan for, which is something unheard of in the design, construction industry, where you present people with a plan in the community, and it almost changed. Design decisions were made on site, material revisions, this instead of that, weight, 2 layers done. It was almost topsy-turvy in a way, but it was me, and I think most design practitioners here as well, sort of like unlearning the conventional construction process of building, that you actually need to be at the behest of what the community has to say, what's their ideal method of constructing this smart hut, to listen to them, to be patient. So I think that was a lovely learning curve and an incredibly humbling experience.
Yeah, I must add that, not only listening to community members, but listening to the elders, right? Because it was quite clear from the start that we are the elders, that's them, and you are the young ones. And so, we will direct you and tell you what to do. And yes, we'll hear you out here and there, but the bulk of this operation is ours. We've like hijacked it just on the basis that we are elders and you are the youth.
Right. Thank you so much, Lesego and Karabo. Unfortunately, we've reached kind of the end of our allocated time today, and we've really only scratched the surface of the rural futurisms practice. And I want to thank Germane for your sharp and incisive questions, and also your honest appreciation, which I think is really epitomizing the idea of a critical friend. So we're really, really grateful to you and to the whole Rural Futurisms team, to Lesego, Karabo, Ruth, Awanda, and Ziyabonga. Yeah, thank you for talking us through your work, for exposing us to, you know, to Mahobistad, and yeah, we are very, very much looking forward to seeing the future iterations of this project emerge. And it's already been posted in the chat. This was our last event for 2023, so you are the cherry on top of our year, and we will continue again next year, February 27th, with another wonderful project, Designing with the Planet, in conversation with Professor Lindsay Bremner. The registration link for this is already in the chat, and you can also stay tuned on our Critical Urbanisms page for further developments in this South Design program. So yeah, thank you all, and yeah, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all so much for this brilliant conversation, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
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 Bye.